how would you, I guess, is the only way, from what I understand, to protect against that flooding is to have a managed switch right upstream from the producer, and then having, I would say, it filter out the traffic. There's no other way, even if you have like a flat network and then you put a managed switch like upstream from that, that wouldn't necessarily solve the problem, correct? As far
Okay,
as I
great
understand.
topic. And by the way, I mentioned like cabling being like number one. This IGMP issue, it's number 2 or 3 for me, meaning like the frequency with which I get this phone call and this is the issue and these are the fixes is very high. And I say that meaning like twice in the last 3 weeks, I've had new customers with this problem and this is the issue. And these are the exact conversations we're having is, how do I solve this? Are you just trying to sell me a switch? And I'm just like, okay, let's talk through all of it. And so he had a perfect example. I asked him to collect some captures. He sent them to me. I'm like, this is definitely what's happening. And so the question is, are you saying the only answer is to buy and configure managed switches? I'm like, no, I'm not saying that. Number one, let's get online with Studio and let's find these producers. You tell me what they are. I can tell you the IP address. You tell me what device that is. He's like, okay, that's this VFD or that's this FlexIO or Point.io. And when he looks, I'm like, there's a chance, depending on the vintage and firmware and legacy and platform, that you could change. Even though it's produce consume, you may have a radio button option to change it from multicast to unicast. Okay. And so in his case, he had, I'd say, like a dozen producers on this network. And in 11 of 12 cases, they were of a vintage that did allow him to change that radio button. So he changed that radio button so that those devices would still be produce consume, but they would be unicast, produce consume. And so those are no longer flooding the network. But then he found one, and I can't remember if it was an older FlexIO or what it was. Doesn't, like, the only it only multicast, so he couldn't change it. He's like, what do I do? I was like, okay, well, now you're coming back to the switch conversation. And then what you said is accurate, Vlad. Like, if you can't solve it in the end device. And the other funny thing is I see that produce consume is used often without context, meaning the programmer isn't choosing produce consume because he has multiple consumers, because produce consume is beautiful. It's more efficient for the producer of the data. It's more efficient for the network when it's set up right. When you actually have multiple consumers, it's more efficient to do that than to unicast it to 5 different people and put it on the network 5 different times. It's rare that I've come across the application where they've actually configured it as produce consume multicast because there are 6 consumers of this data. There are 3 consumers of this data. So that's the other funny part of me. I say a lot that, like, I think some of these automation vendors have done a little bit of a disservice to their customers by not providing enough education about these topics and the concept of what they're doing on these networks that they're not aware of when they do produce consume messaging, because it's easy to configure. And I agree, like it's you know, it's relatively easy to set up produce consume message, maybe relative to an explicit message, but they're not giving the customers and the integrators enough feedback about, well, here's what's actually happening when you do that. And I think when I asked the customer, I asked the integrator, like, do you actually have multiple consumers of this thing? They're like, oh, no. And I was like,
I mean, well, 90% of the time it's 1-to-1, even in my experience.
Yeah.
So it's not.
So then I'm like, yeah, then absolutely, like, toggle this radio button or if it's available, or if you do have the multiple consumer thing, let's talk about this network infrastructure. Because IGMP, if you look at my blog post about managed switch features, that I think if you can get through this list of features and tell me none of them apply to your scenario, fine, go use it on a managed switch. But IGMP is on that list because of this reason in large part. But I think we're all kind of saying the same thing, that that's interesting, because likely if there is multicasting happening on the network, it's happening. And I don't mean this as a negative way to the programmer. I just literally mean out of ignorance. They are not aware what is happening as a result of this configuration, and particularly of the net effect and the impact of that, because it's invisible. It's in the black box.